Hello everybody, this is a follow-up to the Most from the Most episode that went up a little while ago. So many great questions and comments on this one. This whole topic, of really what you get from really expensive gear versus more affordable gear. It's a big question, and it's been a really cool exploration. It seems like an important one for people. There's a lot of very cool thoughts and feelings about this, so I wanted to dig into that. I just got back into Vermont. I was out in California, did the AES convention. That was cool with Undertone out there. It was small. Surprisingly small, at this point. I was, I don't know. I guess it wasn't that surprising. I was expecting it to be small. That universe just continues to shrink. It is what it is. But it was cool. I got to see a bunch of cool buddies and friends and, reconnect with people. It's cool to hang out with a bunch of nerds. It's awesome. So that was great, but back here, ready to dive back into things. I wanted to do this follow-up. This is going to be cool. So let's just dive right in. Grabbed a bunch of stuff off of the website, some YouTube stuff, where questions were coming in from. So here we go. So all this first stuff is going to be from the website. First one is username Caleb Erickson Music. And the question is, how did you reamp these electrics? Did you have a DI of the original electrics? Thanks for all the videos. So yes, that's exactly what happened. When I recorded this originally, they were all amp simulators, and so I would have to record DIs in order to use those, and all I had was a little Antelope Orion Studio interface, and this is one of these things where it's got every type of input and output you would need. And so back in Topanga, I just took a guitar and plugged it directly to the DI input on the Antelope unit, captured the DIs that way. And when I was in Topanga, I did a little bit of reamping. I experimented with that a little bit with an actual amp that I had kicking around there, and it has a built-in DI input on the Antelope Orion Studio thing. And so I did it that way there. Once I got back to Vermont, I took those same DI performances. I didn't want to change the performance or change the guitar that was used, because in this case, I thought it was most informative to really compare the amp simulators versus real amps. That was really what I was trying to get a sense of with this particular experiment. And so I took that captured DI signal with the Antelope Orion Studio and put it through an Undertone Audio satellite reamp box and just ran it through amps that I had here. So that's how it happened. Same identical performances, just a different amp. So there you go. Okay, so username Conrising, and it says, it looks like you are just applying the tuning on the bass to the DI track. Did you run into any issues with phase as a result on that one note, or did you tune before reamping? You answered it right there. I always run into tons of issues when tuning multiple mics on the same source unless I bust before tuning. Yeah, you totally figured it out there. So in this case, I tuned the DI and then used that signal to send out for all the reamping. So it's the identical signal the identical tuned performance for all of that stuff, DI and amps all together. So yeah, you guessed it there. And I do a similar thing. If I have multiple mics and I want to tune a bass sound, I got to bust them together, get my sound, and then tune that. With auto-tune, you can do a thing where is set up a stereo auto-tune plugin and have it reference one side or the other. And so sometimes what I would do is I would send the DI to the left side, have my amp blend going through the right side. So all the tuning is being done referenced to the DI signal, but tuning the amp signals. So I don't know, that was another thing that I had to sort out at one point. But yeah, that was a good question. Okay, so then we got username Silver Beetle. It's asked, this person is asking, what tape are you using? Is it GP9 or 456? I typed in an answer, but I'm happy to mention it again here. I'm using 456 on the MM1200. I still have a few rolls of healthy 456 that hasn't gotten sticky or worn out yet. And I'm finding that it is still the most stable, even compared to buying brand new tape now. I'm about to dig deeper into that and really test some stuff. I got rolls of ATR and the new RTM stuff, And so I'm going to compare those things and really kind of see what's working the best out of the new stuff, because I'm going to run out of my, my stash of tape, that I've already had. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so then we have a username Ali Guitar, I think. And the question is, I hope you don't mind, on the guitar reamping part of the video, did you go straight from the microphones to the tape machine? And if you used any preamps, which ones did you use? Did you push them a lot? Thanks again. So my setup right now is that the first 6 tie lines out in my big room are patched to go to the preamps in my RCA tube console. So generally, most of the time, I'm going through those preamps. I'm just really enjoying them right now, and I use them for a lot of stuff. Then the room mics were plugged in on the other side of the room. Those tie lines are normally into Undertone audio preamps. So the room mics were Undertone audio solid state preamps. The close mics were all RCA tube preamps. And I did do some compressing. Yeah, it was a little different depending on what the source was. So with the heavier guitars where I had multiple mics and multiple amps going, I printed the digital version direct from the mic preamps into the computer first. Then I got a blend of that stuff and put it through the tape machine blended with a little bit of EQ and compression at that point. And on this, I was generally using, either DBX 160s or this ADR, Audio Design Research Compex for compressing the guitars. Those were working well. There was a whole mix set up as I was printing this stuff, and so I didn't have the luxury of using whatever stuff I want to use. Some of the other ones I like. My 1176s can be great on guitar. That EMI compressor that you hear on the drums, that's a great guitar compressor, but those were being used. And so I was going for 160s and the ADR Compex to compress the guitars. So I did try and, have them go through when it went through the tape machine, have it be a finished-ish sound going into the computer. And so at that point, I'm making relatively minor EQ adjustments. It's my preference to try and get the compression part of it done, especially when I have the luxury of, the performance is already finished. I'm just really geeking out on the sound. I can run it through the tape machine, dial in my compressor, hear it in context, really get everything, so it's really feeling right, and then just capture it in and be done. So when I'm, blending it into the mix, I'm not having to really think about what compressor should I use. It's usually just a little bit of EQ and stuff from that point, and just setting the level and pan and stuff. So yeah, good question. Okay, so now we've got Caleb has a username Caleb, and it looks like, curious to know what your Distressor settings are when setting your initial drum levels with the tape EQ stuff. Okay, so yeah, I did not get a picture of that, but the units that I use, I have 4 Distressors available in my room. One of them I was using on the snare ultimately, but in that initial round I was using another pair that were over here. They haven't been changed since. They're still sitting here. So I took a picture of the settings, and I'm going to pull that up now. Yeah, so here's the setting. This is pretty common for me. So 20-to-1, you set the input, because there's no threshold control on this thing. You just set the input so you're getting the amount of compression that you want. And it's usually compressing, on all the significant hits up around 12 or 14. And then slowest attack, the release anywhere from, 1 to 2 to 3, just depending on the tempo and how much you want to pull the room sound forward. In this case, it was a release of 3, and then the output is just sort of set, to get the signal back in at a good level. And then this detector is always like this. All 3 lights on. High pass with the mid boost and linked together. Been doing that for 20 years. So that's typically my setting for just an overall drum mix distressor compression. Yeah, thank you for mentioning it, because I did not cover that when I was moving through printing that drum stuff. All right, so now we've got, okay, the question here, could you talk a bit about how you set up your MM1200 so it doesn't clip the converters on playback, but still gives you the tone you're after when hitting the tape? Okay, sure, it's pretty straightforward. So, there's a long history of tape level standards, and, they were originally established what they thought was going to be the best thing to do, which was really a reflection of the limitations of the electronics and the tape formulas that were available at the time. And then soon after, people realized, you know what, we should really be printing hotter than that. And so then they started coming up with a standard which was +3, and they would call it +3 over 185, and it's 185 nanowebers per meter. So that was the original standard that was established for what 0 should be on the tape machine, 185 nanowebers per meter. And so then people started doing +3 over 185. And then tape formulas got better, and the tape machines got better at handling higher levels and getting them on and off the tape machine. And so then +6 became the standard. So when I really got into recording on multi-track machines, +6 was really the standard. And then that was right around the time when high-level tape started to come out. So it was originally 3M 996. Still, my feeling, that was the best tape ever made. Of course, they stopped, but 996 was incredible. So that's what I used for the Third Eye Blind record, Smash Mouth records, all of that, like, you know, late 90s, early 2000s stuff. It was all 3M 996 until they stopped making it. And then Ampex came out with their version of high-level tape, which was GP9. And and those tape formulas were supposed to allow you to print even higher levels. And so people would do, you know, +8 or +9 over 185. And so that is what I'm doing with the Ampex MM1200. I'm calibrating that machine. I believe what I settled on was +8 over 185. And so what that is doing is basically I'm turning up the gain on the record calibration. So it's putting more magnetic information on the tape and then turning it down on the repro calibration side. So it still ends up 0, you know, going in and out of the tape machine. There's just a lot more magnetic information being put on the tape. And the tape has a very unique way that it limits its level. There is just a point where that ferrous oxide that's, you know, glued to the plastic backing, it just saturates with magnetic information. It cannot hold anymore. And so it's a very smooth and very hard cutoff for the limiting on there. It's a unique quality that tape machines have. And so, you know, I set it up so on that MM1200, it doesn't matter how much I turn it up. That, you know, oxide material on the tape just completely saturates with magnetic information, and you're not going to be able to put any more through it. It just stops. It's a hard wall, and then what comes out the other side, that hard wall is set at a point where it won't clip the input of my computer. I calibrate my computer -18 dBFS. That's going to matter depending on how you calibrate your converters. That all sort of plays into this. But with my setup, +8 over 185 with a -18 dBFS calibration on the converters got me there. And it works great. And so, you know, the +8, and I'm using 456, which in theory is not, you know, is not supposed to handle that as well. So that's part of it. If I put 996 or GP9 on there, it might actually start to clip a little bit. I got to do that experiment and see if it's really that big of a difference with the tape formulas. But yeah, that combination has worked great on my setup. So hopefully that explains it. Okay, so then we've got, so somebody mentioned a Langevin 251A plugin, maybe. That's good high end. I agree, beautiful high end on those things. There's a plugin that exists already. I think they did a great job with it. It is a Kazrog plugin. I'm sure you've seen it in mixed deconstructions before. I use it. It feels really good. I haven't done a direct A/B between them, but that is definitely one of my go-to plugins. So I do recommend that. If you liked the sound of those Langevin, passive graphic EQs, I highly recommend the Kazrog version. It's great. Okay, let's see. Would you be able to talk about your voice? Okay, so this is, and I apologize. That last one was username Alan Rusty Dooley. Okay, and I'm not calling out the names here. I should be doing this. So let's go back. Okay, and then the MM1200, the tape level one, was username ogsjackbeats, something like that, yeah. Okay, and so now we've got username Sam Ballet. And the question is, would you be able to talk about your voice compression process? Like, why would you choose to use one or two compressors? In what order? Why is the 1176 type compression here used first and the Unfairchild second? The amount of compression at each stage, which settings you'd use, and why would this change for genre, for gender, or for the gender of the singer to feel more modern or vintage? Okay, yeah, so I generally go for two compressors if there's a lot of dynamics to manage, you know, where there's just really soft sections, really loud sections. My voice on this thing just needed a lot of help. My voice is challenging to record for sure. And it just doesn't have that sort of like smooth, effortless quality to it. And so some extra compression to hold it in place is helpful. And really the difference to me is that you can end up with, I guess this is sort of the general principle, is you can end up with a vocal that has a more even level, so it just stays in the same place without sounding compressed as much by using more than one compressor. So you start to hear the artifacts of compression when you have to set it more aggressively and you're doing tons and tons of compression. There are very few compressors that sound transparent when you're doing tons of compression. And so that's also kind of the difference. Sometimes it sounds really cool to have it sound really, really compressed and hear those artifacts as part of the effect. And if that's the case, then I would lean more towards using just a single compressor and really mashing it, and you'll hear the effect of the compression. If you really need things to be super, super level, but you don't want to hear the compression effect as much, then that's when you use multiple compressors. And so I tend to go for something that is really fast and more transparent sounding for the initial round of compression. So in this case, I feel 1176 is like that, and this other Decca, JFET style compressor, very similar. It can handle all these huge swings of volume and compression, and it just kind of it just hangs out right there. You don't hear it getting jerked around and hear all these sort of artifacts from it. And then I love the tone and texture of the Unfairchild. And I would use just the Unfairchild if I wanted it to sound more compressed, which is a really cool sound. It's more like, an old sort of Beatles vocal sound kind of thing. If you listen to something like I Am the Walrus, where John's voice is just mashed. I'm pretty sure it's a, Fairchild 660 on that thing. It sounds amazing, really, really cool sound. You hear all this like impact and distortion, all this crazy stuff that the compressor is doing. It's part of the effect. And so that's the time to do something like that if you want to hear all of those artifacts of the compression. And so, using the two compressors, you can have way more level control and really have it sound more like somebody's riding the fader, because neither of the compressors are really just getting into that range where they're really struggling to do what you're asking it to, and you start hearing the artifacts. One of the things we showed at the AES convention, Undertone Audio is going to be coming out with a pulse width modulation style compressor, or there was Pi Audio that I think was the first to do this. And man, are those things amazing. They are so incredible on vocals and for exactly this kind of thing. For vocal compression, it sounds the most like somebody riding a fader of any compressor I've ever heard. So in that case, that would be an amazing compressor to go to first, and then if you want to get more color or whatever, you can go through a Fairchild type thing, or maybe a UA 175 type thing, something that has more color to it. So that's typically how I think about it and why I would make those choices. So hopefully that explains, the thinking behind it. Okay, so now we've got username. I think this is username male cliche. I hope I'm reading that right. And this is just a mention here. I got SonicWorks working on a modern computer. It's a little involved, but not too bad. And then invited me to message them if I want to figure out how to get it going. I'm going to try and I want to do that as soon as I have time to do it. And then made the comment, vocal refresh is so cool. If you haven't heard me mention, I've talked about it in a few of these episodes. If you go back to probably the Smash Mouth All-Star episode, I definitely used it on that song. This algorithm it had in there called Vocal Fresh, very unique. Never heard anything else like it. Very, very cool. So, I'm going to see if I can get it going again. It would be cool to hear that again. So, I don't know. If anybody out there, if you stumbled across SonicWorks, man, that is a cool effect for sure on vocals. Okay, so then this next one, this is username msartini, and it says, oh, this is another cool, useful comment. I noticed that you were bypassing each plugin separately. You might have a reason for this, but if you hold Control, you can click any plugin in the chain and it will bypass that plugin and any others that follow. Amazing. I had no idea that Pro Tools did that. I assume this is for Pro Tools. I'm going to start doing that. That's super useful. Thank you for that. Okay, so then here's another one. Okay, so this is username Eerie Swirl, and it says, it looks like recording real amps made the biggest difference, considering that the amp simulation plugin costs about 250 pounds, 250 euros. I would guess that a real amp around the same price would possibly sound better than the plugin. Yeah, if you're just going by cost, I would hope so. But that's all changing. That's not necessarily always the case. I think that if all the audio tracks were identical for both the analog and laptop mix, the two mixes would be not that much different. What are your thoughts on that? So I believe the question here is that the difference in the sound of the guitar amps was a huge difference that sort of dominated the difference in what was being heard between these mixes. And I think that's true. I think that is by far the most audible and most significant difference. And it was a big one. I think it really skewed things towards the analog mix a lot. And so then, but there are other differences as well. And, the drums certainly had a different character to them. And I would say there were things about the analog drums that I liked, but there was actually, on the digital mix, the more I've sort of reflected on it, I definitely like the snare drum sound better on the digital mix, for sure. And towards the end of that analog mix, it was kind of challenging. And I mentioned it in the episode, but some of the, inconsistencies in my playing were revealed more in the analog mix, and the digital mix was able to smooth that stuff out better and ultimately end up with a snare drum sound that I think was just better. I think it just sat better in the track and was just a cooler sound. I just liked it better. So, there's a little bit of both. The analog mix to me, even though I think the net result was a little more satisfying sounding to me, there were things about the digital mix that I think are definitely better. And so, ultimately it's just going to be a matter of trying to get all the best from all these different tools, and bringing them all together. So, but yeah, good question. Okay, so we've got, so this is from username Old School. And the question is, what was the plugin used in the drum delay track? You kind of skipped that part by accident. Yeah. I didn't think to highlight it because it's such a generic plugin. It is the generic, built-in Avid Mod Delay 3 plugin, I think is what it is. Let me confirm that. It's this one, Mod Delay 3. It's as basic as it gets. There's no color on it. It's just a digital delay. So the delayed signal sounds identical to whatever signal you're putting into it, just comes out later. There was nothing special about the plugin choice, so I sort of forgot to mention it. But thank you for asking, so I could bring that out. Okay, so next one is username Arbel1, I think. And the question is, I'd love to be able to hear the whole song played through in its entirety with the new mix. Possibly you can make that downloadable. I'll do that, and I'll put a link to it in the description of this follow-up video, so you can just download it and check it out. That'll be easy to do. I'll pull the session up. It was printed. I'll just export it and do that. Cool. Thanks for asking for that. You can all listen to it, because I never really let the thing play through by itself. The only time it played through, I was A-Bing. Okay, this is a cool comment here and thought about this. So this is username BKF Audio, and it says, the difference on the guitar and bass tone was amazing. Also, it seems clear that analog tape has no match in the plug-in world, though some come close. Other thing I picked up from this is how important it is to master your particular set of tools and find what works for you. It seems clear that you have decades of experience with certain analog tools that you know how to dial in, to the point where they don't even need further tweaking in the mix. I think there is something to be said about spending a lot of time with the tools you have and mastering them, finding where they really shine. Even with plugins, it takes a lot of time and experience to find the ones that really shine and find a way to use them that works for you. I'm also curious how much of the difference comes from the monitoring environment as well. That has to make a big difference in how you make decisions. Yeah, so I think this is an important aspect to highlight of this. So with the first part, so this particular experiment, and specifically having me do this experiment, is definitely going to be skewed a little bit to the analog side. I've been mixing with analog tools for 30 years. And I've worked with computers a lot along the way. I mean, I was in on computers very, very early on. In T-Ride, man, we toured with an Atari 1040 ST triggering samples, you know, like I was all about it. I love using computers. Not all the time, most of the time. And so I've always embraced the computers, but analog tools have always really been my go-to, and that's really where I, formed my mixing sort of tools and approach, was with analog tools. And so when I'm mixing in the digital realm, there's no question, there's people out there that have really committed themselves to that approach and are just more highly evolved mixing in that world. So it's kind of a trade-off. Like it might make sense to have me do a mix in the analog world and have somebody who's really an expert at mixing in the digital world to represent that side of it. There's pitfalls there as well, where it's like, if you're really just trying to compare the different technologies, you can also be confused by different actual techniques that are being used. Because now we're talking about two totally different people and two totally different mixing approaches. And so in this case, it might be closer to being able to compare the technologies, because I approach mixing in the computer very similar to how I approach mixing in the analog world. It's certainly close. I try to approach it the same way. There's things I have to do different because those tools don't respond the same for me, and I try to make adjustments to accommodate that in how I'm doing things. And so, but it's an interesting point, like I'm not really putting this out there in the world to be like, this is sort of like the definitive, assessment of what's better, analog or digital. I wouldn't be so bold as to even try and suggest that. It's just one experiment of many of just my process of trying to figure out really what is working for me now that I have all this stuff available to me. I've already made the leap in the direction that I know I want to incorporate both. I've committed to a hybrid setup because there's tools in both domains that I adore, I love using. And I've done albums in the past, even when I had a huge console sitting in front of me, where I ended up mixing mostly in the computer. The most important song on the All American Rejects record, Gives You Hell, that is an in-the-box mix, for sure. And then, so the band Aqualung, that whole record got mixed in the computer. And I had a big old console sitting in front of me. It made more sense to do it that way. He was very comfortable working in that environment. He didn't have any big attachment to analog stuff. His first record he made in his bedroom, with all computer stuff, and so worked great for him. He was happy with that. And so the way we were moving, we had to mix a lot of stuff very quickly, and so it just felt better to do it in the computer. So I've done both, but I am admittedly a more analog-centric mixer, for sure. So I am not the best representative of what is truly possible in the world of digital mixing. Doing my best. I think I'm catching up there, but that is an aspect of the experiment that I did that has a little bit of a bias to it. So there you go. I think it's important to acknowledge that reality. So, okay, great comment. Okay, so now we have a comment and question from username CD Badger. So incredible how different the analog mix sounds, especially how much more humanity is in those electric guitars, even though it's technically the same performance. One thing I've noticed on some of your recent mix breakdowns that I've been meaning to ask about is how you don't seem to high pass all that often, especially on sources that I usually find myself needing to. When you showed the vocal send to the tape, you showed that it had been high pass before tape. Is this the same for everything that's going to tape? That is, if you think it will need to be high passed, you're doing it then, or are you just not needing to do it as often? I noticed, especially in the Pro Q analyzer, your low end in the guitar tracks has way less rumble stuff, that stuff I've recorded, than stuff that I've recorded, you know, and has been sent to the mix. So, okay, so yeah, so it's just a question about high passing stuff, and I feel like I still do it a fair amount. And yes, at times I do it going to the tape machine. You know, when I'm printing through the tape machine, generally I do the moves that I'm 100% sure I'm absolutely going to do. And a high pass on guitars is pretty common. You know, yeah, I don't really have a lot of use for anything below 100 hertz on guitar. And often it's higher than that, you know, to really make room for things. And then the vocals, same thing. I know I'm going to do that. And so when I'm printing through the tape machine, if I'm 100% sure that I don't need frequencies in that range, I want to just get rid of them. So I'm not eating up headroom as I'm printing this thing through the tape machine. Because if I print it with all those extra frequencies in there, I can't set the level as hot, and I remove them later and turn the volume up, it's just going to have more hiss on it, you know? And so that's generally how I approach it. But yeah, I feel like I am still compartmentalizing things. Maybe it wasn't as evident on this thing because some of it happened on the way through the tape machine, and so I wasn't doing as much on playback. But yeah, interesting. I hadn't noticed that difference. Now I'm going to be thinking about it. But thank you for the comment. Okay, this is kind of a long one, but I think it's worth digging into this one. There's some cool thoughts in here. So this is username Bob Camera Magmatica. Okay, so it says, I feel like yes, the sound difference is there, but it's mainly the difference in A, what analog stuff makes you feel okay to do, and B, how one tends to have a fairly complex rig like yours that allows one to just give broad strokes when it's time to without setting stuff up constantly. And then C, getting to know something that exists in real world is, and will be, I hope at least, looking at the impending virtualization of everything human, easier and more engaging than getting to know a piece of software. Okay, so this is all thoughts kind of about workflow. You know, I've set up all of my analog gear, so it's kind of normaled, and it creates these, you know, like channel strips, and I just patch stuff up, and it's already there, and I can just reach and grab it and go, and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I agree. You know, like the ease of use and having things just at your fingertips really makes a big difference. You know, when you're really just trying to get to a sound quickly. You know. And so then on this last part, I want to point out that I have nothing against in the box music or everything for that matters. But when I see exceptional Pro Tools users, I'm more amazed by how they can operate the physical side of things, shortcuts and more in general, the hands that sort of dance to, that takes place on the keyboard more than what's going on inside the software. In other words, I feel like who gets better at in-the-box stuff is who gets better at using the physical computer in front of the person. Plugins are tedious for me because the only way to use them is with a mouse. There's little to no keyboard integration, just some command control option stuff for some clicks, but that's it. You can't dance to it, like, for example, when I'm writing this comment. All that aside, yeah, so I guess this person can type very fast. All that aside, I was curious about your gating structure. Okay, so now here's a question. Curious about your gating structure, and was pretty convinced by your explanation of it. But I'm seriously pissed off by having huge track counts in general. Okay, so I think this is a comment that, you know, I'm creating an extra track where I'm editing a key track to key a gate that's on the track that I'm actually listening to. And so you're doubling up certain tracks in order to do that. It just increases your overall track count. And so, okay, I feel like I got to reduce wherever you can reduce, or when I will open the session again in 1 to 2 weeks, I will get completely mad, especially when working on a full record. So I use this alternative way of gating toms that only uses one track and gets rid of key tracks and all that. Put one gate on the channel, set how you normally would set your trusty Pro, FabFilter Pro G or whatever, and then place a second gate after that. Set it to ducking mode and key it with the cleanest, shortest, attackiest snare track you have. So there is a key involved, but it's not, a dedicated track that's just there for keying. You can use, a snare track that's part of the mix. This way, not only you have control over the envelope of the first gate, the one that does the heavy lifting, isolating the toms most of the times, but you also have control on how you want the omnipresent snare to disappear from your tracks, especially in intricate rhythm patterns like this. Then you can simply edit out the sections of the clip where there's no tom action whatsoever with an easy strip silence move to avoid mistriggers in this first gate due to the heavy kick attacks or neighboring tom stuff. I feel this is a very safe and most of all delay compensation safe way to do it. I work in Logic Pro, and sometimes delay compensation just fluctuates and you can't do a thing to make it stop. Thus, the less intricate the routing is, the better. So yeah, it's a cool approach. So there's basically, and I've experimented with stuff like this at times. Yeah, maybe more in the analog world when I had less flexibility with all of this gating stuff. But so there's a gate that's doing the majority of the work, and then I would consider it almost like a safety net. So if a snare drum does happen to sneak through, the gate that is just trying to listen for the tom hits, but sometimes the snare can be kind of loud in the tom mics, there's a ducker that is ducking whenever the snare hits. And so it can be a great way to have a little safety net for the snares that might sneak through. And the one thing that can be tricky is that if you have a snare hit right after a tom hit, something like that, that the decay of that tom can get cut off. And my experience is that even though there's a snare hit right after it, I'm okay having a little bit of the snare sound blend in from that tom mic and preserve the decay that I would, had chosen for the gating of the tom. So that's the only potential downside of putting a snare trigger ducker on your tom mic is if you got a snare coming right after tom, it's going to steal the ring of that tom. So, but it can be very, very useful. It's a cool trick. All right, so thank you for mentioning that. All right, so now we've got just a recommendation. This is from user Robert G. Would be really interesting if you could come close to the real amps with your own amp captures. Neural amp model is a really good and easy capture process. You just reamp a reference file through it and can batch process later. I'm definitely going to get into this for sure. So I'm going to try Neural Amp Modeler. I got hung up before because I think I installed it, it was crashing, I couldn't get it to work, and I had to move on. But I'm going to get that thing to work, and I'm going to try it. I'm very curious now because, we just went through this. Like, I used some other captures that people made. They're not bad, but it was definitely not what I was able to get just plugging through an amp. I would love to be able to pull up one of those sounds again. Easy to get, nothing particularly esoteric. Just went through the amp, set a couple knobs, put a 57 on it, and there you go. And capture that sound and really see how close it is. I'm curious about it. So, we'll see. Definitely going to try that. Okay, so thank you for that comment. And so this is now username Adam G. Saucy, I believe. And it says, I'm finding myself feeling relieved that the analog processing and all the choice gear really does sound that much better than the plugins and emulations. The guitar sounds, especially here, are just jaw-droppingly better. Totally night and day. I think we all feel that. Also, so thankful that you went over how you EQ drums to tape in the beginning. That's something I find myself struggling with. How best to shape the feel of the kit on the way in without over or undercooking things. Okay, yeah, cool. Well, thank you for that. That was mostly just a couple comments. So then we have, what is this? username Ruggins. I would love your take on why most of the very top mixing engineers mix in the box, when clearly analog sounds so much better in most cases. Talking about mixing here specifically, it's a very good question. And so there's a lot of, some of this becomes subjective for sure. So I think for, for the category of modern popular music, mixing in the box is probably mostly better. That has become a sound unto itself, a style and sound unto itself that is just a very much more digital centric thing. And it's a cool sound. It's great. I don't know that mixing that stuff on an analog console is really going to be that much better. And that is the stuff that's really driving the music industry now. So anything from, you name it, from Kendrick Lamar to Demon Hunter to Dua Lipa to whatever, any version of this more sort of modern pop, hip-hoppy-ish electronic stuff, If you're talking about more traditional band type stuff, rock bands, then there's the possibility that mixing with analog equipment, that's really where that stuff came from, could be more effective. Mostly because it's just more familiar, like I think people are more used to hearing that style of music with that style of mixing and tools. And so that's what makes it seem better in a sense, because I think it's just more familiar sounding. So the other thing is that if you're really a professional mixer in the business of mixing, that's how you pay your bills, then what that process has turned into, and I worked through this transition. So, I started late 80s and 90s when people weren't mixing in the box at all. Nobody was doing it. And then into late 90s, 2000s when that transition started to happen. I was there, in the moment when basically Universal Music, I think maybe the biggest record label on the planet, they've absorbed many other labels. They have who knows how many artists. They basically stated at a certain point, we will only work within the box mixers because they want to be able to do recalls anytime and not have it be a big drama. And so, that transition just happened at a certain point. And there were people that were just crushing, doing in the box mixes. So, like Serban Gaina, his mixes sound incredible. And I don't really know exactly what his setup is or how he does things, but what I hear is that is pretty much mostly or entirely in the box. And his mixes sound great, And so from the standpoint of the people that are hiring him, when they come back later and say, hey, can we get that mix with this one word replaced or whatever? It's like, sure, no problem. I'll boot it up and do it, It takes me, 5-10 minutes to load the mix, and I can make the change and send it out, If that mix was done on a giant SSL console with 1 million tracks and a bunch of crap outboard gear, put in there, and inserted and all this stuff and 1 million notes and documentation, all that shit, and somebody says, hey, can we just recall that mix and remove the one thing, It's like a huge ordeal, It's like a full day of resetting settings, even with an SSL that shows you when the settings match up on a screen. A lot of times if you're mixing on a vintage console that doesn't have recall on it, you're looking at pictures and manually doing stuff and trying to make sure you don't miss any details, try and set all the outboard gear, patch it all back in, looking at your notes. You get to the point where, okay, everything should be right. You hit play, doesn't sound the same. Oh my God, what's going on? It's not easy recalling big, complicated analog mixes. It sucks. And so, I think the workflow and the ease of recallability is just made it impossible, And so I would say most professional mixers at this point, unless they're, on a very sort of niche genre-specific type of mixing, are going to be either in the box or some version of, hybrid, very in the box kind of thing, And so, that transition for the business of mixing, there was no stopping it. People were just going to make that transition. you know, there's still some anomalies out there. If you make a T-Bone Burnett record, I imagine he's probably not going to mix it in the box, you know. And so he does a very specific kind of music, and, you know, he does his thing. Everybody respects and enjoys what he does, and that's just what it is. If you want T-Bone to do your thing, that's the way it's going to go, you know. But yeah, if you're doing a Taylor Swift record, that is going to get mixed in the box for sure. There's going to be a million different versions and iterations and recalls, and 5 million people need to have their say and input, and this person wants the hi-hat louder and that person wants this thing, and can we try this edit or what? Like, yeah, that's the way that goes. So that's my feeling about it. Okay, good question. Okay, so now we've got username Casio Zamboto. And so the comment is, analog mix has great openness. Guitars sound amazing. Drums are super 3D and punchy, and the new ambient stuff, especially in the verse, is superb. But the bass on the laptop mix has something special in the mid-range. I really believe a great mastering would improve the laptop mix to sound more alike of the greatness of the analog one. Okay. Yeah, I agree. This to me is not, the difference between these was not just like this absolute slam dunk analog is better. Like I was just saying, there are things about that mix I like better, for sure. And so, you know, yeah, it's not that simple. It's not this thing of like, oh my God, analog's better. And so, you know, I think I mentioned along the way, there are things about, there was like a punchiness and clarity in the amp simulation of the bass that I liked and that I missed a little bit. Even though I really liked sort of the grindy character of the real amps for the bass guitar, there was something that did get lost. I think maybe my treatment of the DI was a little heavy-handed, and I lost a little something there. But yeah, there's things about the digital mix that's great. And, you know, it would be interesting to sort of go back to that and, you know, try and, now that there's sort of like an example of what the analog version can sound like, to go back and see if the digital mix can get closer. I think somebody asked for that, and it's an experiment that would be interesting to try. There's going to be a point where I'm going to not want to work on this song anymore. So I would love to get something new going, but you know, if I have the patience for it, I'd be curious to see what happens there. And the other thing I didn't comment on that was mentioned earlier is about the monitoring in the room. It makes a big difference. It's so much easier for me to really hear what's going on, especially in the low end in this room. And so, you know, yeah, that's one of those things. Whether you're mixing digital or analog, it's, you know, it can be an expensive aspect of setting up a music making environment, and it makes a big difference. It really does. I've wrestled with it for decades, finally got to a place where I'm really, really excited and happy about it, and I love it. I trust this room, I trust these speakers, all the information is there, it makes a big difference. It's great. Okay, so here we go, and continuing on here, we've got my son is back from after school here playing drums, so we can hear a little bit of that in the background. Of course, as soon as I close the doors, he stopped playing drums. That's just the way it works. Okay, so here's another comment. This is username Janny Pervan, something like that. And the comment is, much better sounding mix than laptop version, in my opinion, at least for this genre and this source material. I think that's a good sort of disclaimer to add in there. And then says, I'd think even with Strauss monitors, it would be much harder task to treat the source material to get to this level of quality and character only with plugins. Now, when you've done this mix, would be curious to retrace and replicate this sound in the box, like I just mentioned. So this comment sort of addressed it directly. Yeah, now that we have sort of an example of an analog mix that people are generally feeling sounds better, to try and go back to the digital mix and match to that. I bet it could get very, very close. So much of this is about perspective and having a sense of what you're really going for. What is good? What is good sound? And once you can really know what that is and identify it, I think you can get there a lot of different ways with a lot of different tools, you know? And so I think that might be an important experiment to do. Okay, so then there's a comment here. You talk about not wanting to have digital clipping on the drums. But if you're running 32-bit, then there shouldn't be any digital clipping. Am I wrong with that? It's what I've always heard. Yeah, I actually run 24-bit sessions. I don't do 32-bit float. But the other problem for me is that the way most of these A to D converters are designed, they don't have as much headroom as my other analog equipment. They weren't designed to. So they start to clip at around plus 23, 24. My other sort of more classic analog gear, like a Neve preamp or something like that, it clips more like around plus 28. And so it's really trying to get a handle on what you want to clip where. And so I want to make sure that I'm not clipping the electronics in the A to D converter, whether it's the analog input stage or clipping digitally in the computer, either one of those. So, you know, I have it set minus 18, so that means, you know, I can hit, you know, a signal going, I can have a signal going into that thing. So minus 18 is 0 VU, which is plus 4 dB, and so that makes it plus 22 dB. So that means I can't have a signal hit the front of that thing that's more than plus 22 dB, because I believe the converter itself, the first stage of the converter will start to clip, and then it'll clip digitally. So that means that with my other analog gear, I have to sort of bring down its headroom to make sure that I can drive it without clipping. That's why, like, the Undertone Audio mic preamps have a minus 10 dB output pad, because that stuff clips at about plus 27.5. When I push that button, now it's going to clip at plus 17.5. So I will hear the distortion of that preamp before I hear the distortion of my converter. And I very intentionally did that, so I can drive the mic preamp without clipping the converter or distorting the front end input of that converter. So that's my thinking about it. So that last one about the 32-bit, that was username Mickey Crease. I hope I got that right. Okay, so here's another comment or question from Sam Belay. This is, on a lot of the Pro G you have on the drum shells, you engage the lookahead but still have the attack time not set to its fastest. Why is that? I thought someone would engage the lookahead on Pro G to get all of the attack sound from the hits, but if the attack time is set slower than its maximum, it'll probably eat a little bit of the transient. I'm confused. Okay, there's a great question. So what the lookahead allows you to do is, so let's say this is where the transient attack of my actual drum hit is. When I use the lookahead, I can get the gate to open a little before that. And so there's no risk of cutting this off. And that's really what the lookahead is about, is making sure that the gate doesn't open here and you hear the sound of this drum after the initial impact has already happened. And sometimes, you know, it can open after the fact. And gates inherently are flawed in that way. Like, when you use an analog gate, it always cuts off the attack because it has to listen for the sound and then turn on. And it does it as fast as it can, but there's no way it would defy physics for it to be able to listen for the sound, then turn on without cutting off some of that initial sound. And these transients come on really quick, you know? So lookahead is essential. I figured out a way to do it in the analog domain, and I'm grateful that it's built into all of, you know, any gate that's worth using in the digital domain. So you set your lookahead, and so then here's the issue. This is why I don't set the attack to the fastest, because if I set it really fast and this level turns on, boop, instantaneously, all of that ambient noise that's hovering around the snare drum track before the snare drum is hit, all of a sudden cuts on, and you can get a click or a pop. And so in a perfect world, what I'm trying to do is set the look ahead time and the attack time to the same amount. So let's say it's 5 milliseconds of look ahead and 5 milliseconds to ramp in. So the gate starts to open 5 milliseconds early and then eases in to being fully opened right when the drum actually gets hit. So really what you hear ultimately is a clean hit of the drum, and you don't hear the ambience cutting on before the actual drum gets hit. That's the concept. That's what I'm sort of fussing with there. So hopefully that helps explain that. But it's always made sense for me and has, gotten me the best results when I'm using look ahead. So good question. Okay, so now this looks like some YouTube stuff. So first one is from username William Samuels 2980. Says, night and day on the guitar and bass sounds and overall sonic mix quality. Curious if you would say you put an equal amount of time into each version. I'd love to see a future episode, as you hinted, where everything is recorded properly in Vermont, but the analog mix is done strictly as it could have been done in the 90s, i.e. no plugins or extensive editing, versus an in-the-box Topanga mix using only box tools and limited monitoring. So yeah, it's an interesting, sort of other side of this. And, I try my best to approach this stuff objectively. And it's almost impossible to not have a bias and be aware of your own biases. So, and if I was going to guess, I might have an analog bias, even when I'm specifically trying to not have a bias. And the best that I can say is when I'm working on a music project, and it's always been like this for me, whether I'm doing some sort of comparison or I'm just trying to make great music with an artist, I visualize in my mind how I want people to react to this music when they hear it, like for the first time. What I imagine the reaction being. And then I start to form the sound of the music in a way that I think will elicit that reaction. And so I remember when I was working on the laptop mix, my mindset was, I want the reaction to this to be like, no way, that can't be something you just did on your laptop. I really wanted it to inspire that kind of reaction. And I really worked on it to try and do that, to try and make it sound as much like a record that was done on tape machines and consoles as possible. I was imagining that the whole time. Will this elicit that reaction from somebody? Whoa, that's a laptop? No way. God, it sounds like, something that was done on a console or whatever. I was imagining that the whole time. So that's part of how I, approach these things psychologically. Once I got into the analog side, that's a process that I've done so much over so many years that I just kind of fall into my flow. And it's like, I'm going to do this on that. I know this works. I've been using this on that. It's always worked. And I do it. It's like, yep, there's the sound. And I'm specifically going for a thing that I've done a lot in the past. And when I was working on the analog version of this, I did not A/B to the digital mix. Maybe occasionally I'd listen to it just to see how different it was sounding or not. But when I was making specific choices, I was A/Bing like to the Third Eye Blind song that was so helpful towards the end of the digital version, the laptop mix, the song Good For You. So I was really referencing to stuff like that, or that Audioslave song that I love, Show Me How to Live. It's an amazing rock mix. I was A/Bing to that. And so I was, A/Bing to rock mixes that I just think are incredible. I wasn't comparing it to the laptop mix at all, So I think I gave each of them sort of the same kind of attention and placed the same kind of expectations on them. And I worked hard on both of these mixes. I would say ultimately I worked harder on the laptop mix because I'm just less skilled there. There was a lot to be figured out in that process. So I spent more time on the laptop mix for sure. Now there's a comment here. It would be interesting to see everything recorded properly and having the mix done analog, just entirely analog. And the only challenge there is that I didn't set this place up to really do that specifically. I could do a version of it. I don't have a big console here. It's a hybrid setup. And so I designed this place knowing that it is going to be, a combination of both technologies that get sort of merged together. So I'm not really set up to do that in this place. I mean, I could do a version of it where I sort of limit how I use the computer. But yeah, I'm not, this is not set up for that. So I don't know if it would be the best representation of it. But yeah, that would be an interesting experiment. All right, cool comments there. Okay, so this is username Ginger Drums. And so this one is, from the tests on YouTube like AP Mastering Converter Test, over 50% of the audience heard a difference during the video, but failed miserably at telling the difference once blind testing. If you show analog on screen, it will sound better to most people regardless. Okay, so I'm so happy. There's a few people that brought up the question of blind listening on this, and it's a great question. Anybody that knows me knows I am a huge proponent of blind listening. And there's a reason that I didn't do it for me on this, and that's because I think the differences between these two are so immediately apparent that there's no way I'd ever get confused about which one I was listening to. So I typically use blind listening tests when the differences get small enough that I could make a mistake and go, oh, is this one or is this that one? And then do some very detailed listening to make sure I'm hearing a difference that I can identify. But that's really when things sound very close. But what we're talking about here is really just the psychological influence. And so for people that are walking into this YouTube video, they've never heard either of these before. There's differences that are very obvious, but if you label one as analog and label one as digital, that they'll be inclined to say, oh yeah, the one that has the word analog on it is the better sounding one. If I reverse those titles, a lot of people might have said, yeah, the analog one sounds way better, and it would have been the laptop mix. That's absolutely possible on this. Could be very, very true. So, but I guess in this case, the way this thing happened, ultimately in the long form video, once I got all the way to the point where we were going to A/B things, everybody had been listening to that analog mix get put together for 3 hours. Everybody is very clear about what that one sounds like once you get to the end of that process. And when you A/B it, I don't think it's hard to go, yes, that's the analog mix I've just been listening to for the last 3 hours, and that's the digital mix. And so making them blind, I don't think it would have been particularly blind in that context, because there are obviously different sounding mixes, and if you go into the listening already knowing which one is which, then it can't be blind, even if I take the labels off. So in this case, it wasn't going to be super effective to do that, but if I was just taking stuff that nobody had ever heard before and put it out into the world and said, just tell me which one you like better, one's analog, one's digital, that would be a much better test of what people actually prefer and not label them as one or the other. So I totally agree with that. It's a great comment. I love blind A/B everything. So yeah, I mean, in this case, it just the way this came together, it wasn't going to matter. Okay, so here's a question. This is user Kyle Ritchie 9360. And so lots of great multi-track frequency separations on drums and bass. Okay, any reason for not using Gaffle, or did it just not come to mind? So the Gaffle thing, this is a plugin that I use to separate a source. I've been doing it a lot for kick drum into 4 different frequency components and processing each frequency range of the kick drum differently. It's a, pretty complicated, heavy-handed way to do a kick drum. And I was making somewhat of an effort to mix this thing more in the way that I would have mixed on an analog console. And that's not something that I would do on an analog console. There was a version of it that I did where I printed 2 versions of the kick drum, which I normally wouldn't get to do. a really bright one through the tape machine that I drove more, so I'd get more natural tape and analog, you know, coloration on that I could blend in, and then just a regular kick drum sound. And so I tried to work more in a traditional sort of analog mixing type way. So that's why I didn't do the gaffle thing on this. I've been enjoying that. It's been great. It's been getting me great results, but you know, for this comparison, I wanted to try and be a little more traditional in how I was, you know, mixing stuff. Okay, so here's another question. Would you consider going back to your laptop mix and seeing if you can better match your analog mix? We talked about that. I think that could be a cool experiment to do. And here's another comment about doing a blind A/B test. We just talked about that. I think that would be a great idea. There'll probably be another opportunity in the future where I can do that. So before revealing anything about what anything is, just put some stuff out there and say, hey, which one do you like better? One of these is mixed in a laptop, one of these is mixed with all the analog gear. And people can just choose, see which one they like, and see if they can pick out which one's analog, you know? It's a really cool experiment. We're gonna have to do it. Okay, so now here's one. This is username Jordan17Bliss. The one thing that's been driving me insane through this whole most release thing is no acoustic guitar. Yeah, I apologize for that. I'm getting there. Could there possibly be a small add-on where you show us what you would do with acoustic guitars, but being, again, still stuck with the small setup, cheap mics and plugins only? This would be so massive, as so many of us, Project Studio record so many solo artists with a SM7 on vocals and something on acoustic, you know, like a 414 or something. I'm looking forward to doing that. You know, I've been hanging out in Vermont for a while. I got to say, like, I can't believe how quickly this time is passing. I have so many things I want to do in this studio before I go back to California, and I've done not even close to near, you know, half of them, you know. But I'm going to go back to California sort of mid to late December, and once I'm back out there, I'm going to dive back into this stuff. And I would love to do an acoustic version of this. It's, you know, it's just a whole other kind of, yeah, set of tools and stuff. And I got some ideas of what would be a cool microphone choice and stuff like that. So yeah, I'd love to do that. So thank you for suggesting it. Okay, so then we've got username 1899Dan. And the comment is, there is a difference, but if a great player recorded a great song and had some talented mix, there wouldn't be enough difference to matter. I mean, the song would still impress people or be a hit or whatever, but good gear and a good sounding studio don't hurt. And I totally agree. You know, like, this stuff is, these experiments are digging way down into the weeds of, you know, the tools that are available, and this is mostly a big question about optimizing cost and the tools that are used in order to create music. But I agree 100%. In capable hands, you can make amazing sounding recordings, and more importantly, capture the emotional content and message of a musical expression in a laptop and have people receive it and feel the emotional expression that's intended to come across. So you don't have to have expensive analog gear to do that. And I don't think that's the point of this. I think ultimately what I'm hoping to get to is a place where people can feel more confident about using the tools that they have. Because I've said this a million times before, the tools are never as important as how they're used. And I never want people to feel like, man, if I only had this thing, I'd be able to make great recordings, because it's just not true, you know. You can have a laptop, you can have cheap microphones, and you can make really exciting recordings and have them sound amazing and have them communicate the emotion of the song in a powerful, effective way for people to enjoy and connect with. You don't have to have a 1950s RCA tube console to do that, you know. And so I think that's really the point. I'm hoping to empower people in that way with this. Sometimes it's fun to just geek out and listen to all this fancy stuff. It's kind of fun to hear or whatever, and just familiarize yourself with what it does, and maybe that can help elevate what you're trying to achieve with the tools that you have. But I'm not suggesting that you have to have this stuff to make great music. Not even close. Okay, so this is username Declon White is saying, I'm not sure if you did this or not, but I feel you should mix both versions with the same monitoring now, or try to match the digital one. Yes, it's a similar thing. And I did feel like at the outset of this, I was really trying to put myself in the position of what most people are working with. And so now maybe after the fact, we could see what the difference the monitoring makes, and we have sort of like an analog benchmark that we can try and chase. But at the outset, I wanted to really put myself in the position like, hey, this monitoring is not perfect. It's not terrible, but let's see how far we can get with this. So I thought it was important to have, a realistic version of more of a home recording studio setup when I did the initial thing. Okay, so there's a comment here, the question, does this stuff really make a difference? This is username miserable-sod1. The answer, in my opinion, is yes, of course it does. Does it matter to anyone apart from the creator? Probably not. And so really that comes down to the question of, like, is this really going to make this a song that people connect with more, or becomes more successful or more emotionally meaningful for some reason? I think there is a point where it can start to have that kind of an influence. I've used a lot in the past this example of the song Pour Some Sugar on Me. I was just obsessed with that song, not because I like the writing of that song. I don't care about the writing of that song. I never have. I don't care what they're saying. Who knows what they're singing about? I don't care. I love the way it feels when I turn it up. And whether it was done, that song was done a long time ago, so it was certainly done mostly in the analog domain. There are digital tools used, on those records for sure. He was using Fairlights and samplers and stuff. But regardless of the tools that were used, I think sonics do matter at a certain point. And a great mix can really affect the emotional impact of a musical performance. It really can affect those things. You can do a great mix with analog stuff and digital stuff. It can happen in both domains. So we're not really trying to say it's impossible if you don't have this analog stuff, but I think it matters. And I think it matters to the listener. They may not know why they like something better or something feels more emotionally powerful. They don't have to know why. But I find that people go like, yeah, I just like this one, I've been involved with a lot of projects that get mixed by different people and stuff, and when it's right, it's right. And everybody goes, that's great, because the sonics are right, regardless of how it got there. But the sound, I think, does matter. Okay, so then there's a comment here. This one was just funny. Username DKPit3912. Just from that small comparison snip at the end, it is discouraging. It is night and day, not even close. As great as you are, I just hope you suck at the laptop in the box mixing. That would help. And so, I've already said it, but like, I've spent decades mixing with analog tools, and I would say I'm less experienced mixing in the box. So there are aspects of that comment that are definitely true. There are people out there that are way better mixing in the computer than I am. So I'm not the best representative of that work environment for mixing. So there you go. Hopefully that makes you feel better. Okay, this one's interesting, and I will consider taking this on. This is super challenging. Okay, this is a comment from Yo-Yo Lebetur. It says, in a way, the most from the least video did not live up to its title, as you put no restriction on plugins. And this came up along the way as well. As you said in the video, using a $200 Soothe is kind of cheating, for example. And I agree. I have a lot of plugins. I've got thousands of dollars worth of plugins that I've bought and accumulated over the years. Even though they're literally can be a 10th or 100th the cost of their analog counterparts, it still costs money. They ain't free. And so what's being proposed here is, what if you had to mix with stock freeware and under $50 worth of plugins? So that is a challenge for sure, because I hope this is not the case, but right now I'm feeling the only reason I'm really even getting in the ballpark with the laptop mix is because the plugins have evolved so much, especially in just like the last maybe 3, 4, 5 years. They've really, really improved a lot. And so, but I'm game. I'll take this on, learn how to use Reaper and just whatever plugins come with it and see what we can do. That will be challenging for sure. Okay, but great. It's a great comment. Okay, so now we've got username home 719. We'll be really interested to see most released with gear that you or other people think are really good for its price. For instance, I think my SE Electronics SE7 really compares to small diaphragm condensers that are way more expensive. So not just try the cheapest gear you could find, but rather use relatively inexpensive stuff where you really get bang for your buck. Okay, so this is sort of like a mid-level. We want to take a stab at every single version of this. So we just had the example of like, how about the version where you spend no money at all, free Reaper software and no, plugins other than what's included. And now this person is suggesting, instead of going for the super cheap, there is stuff out there that's affordable, and really trying to figure out, of the things that are in sort of the affordable range, microphones that are not thousands of dollars, but maybe just a microphone for $200, $300, $400. Like, which ones of those might really be the ones to get and essentially perform the same as a vintage, microphone that could be worth $15,000. So that's also could be a really cool experiment to do. I think if I dove into that, that would take some resources to invest in those tools, that equipment. I might have to get manufacturers involved or something to do that. I don't want to have to buy a bunch of that stuff to do it in a meaningful way. So I don't know. I'm game to try anything if it's doable. Okay. I think that's everything we got for this episode. There's a couple other things I need to get caught up on, and so I'll probably do another follow-up thing that's just a grab all of various episodes of questions and comments that have accumulated. But as always, man, thank you so much for participating in this, tuning in, listening, checking out these long-ass videos that I make, and giving all this really thoughtful input and asking these questions. It always brings out so much cool additional, ideas and observations about all this stuff. So I really appreciate it, everybody being involved in this, and love this community. All right, I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.